Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Julian, and I'm here with Max. And today we're going to be talking about 90s. This is a continuation of our series that we've been doing over the past couple of weeks, and let's get right into it.
All right. So, as usual, we kind of start this off with a few basic thoughts I have from this era. And the notes I have are that the 90s were the height of the NBA's popularity. There was a transition during the early 90s from the ABC broadcasting to NBC, and this saw the largest viewership the NBA had to date. And this was largely due to the presence of one great Michael Jordan. His star power brought a thrilling style to his game, and it brought in viewers easily, and it allowed for viewership to become more prevalent, and it also saw a large increase in international viewership as well. The most viewed NBA games of all time are both Jordan games in the 98 and 93 NBA Finals, as well as the most viewed All-Star games also occurring during Jordan's heyday. One other big thing I found from this era is that it was kind of the start of international players making the jump from places like Europe and Australia to the NBA, where you have guys like, to name a few, Hakeem Olajuwon, Dikembe Mutombo, Arvydas Sabonis, Toni Kukoc, Drazen Petrovic, and a bunch of other guys. They first came into the game during the 90s, and they brought savvy play as well as the first emphasizing of actual basketball talent over athleticism. And I think that's a big stepping stone for the NBA to have this influx of international players. Would you agree?
Yeah. International players were definitely a big part of the 90s. Like, they were a bunch of the players that were international kind of paved the way for players right now that come from overseas, like Porzingis, Luca, all those guys.
Yep. And then just an overall view on the style of the era. There was a resurgence in dominant centers and also grinded out slow games battled in the post. We're going to be talking about the top players of this era in a bit, and I find that most of them are centers or big men, which I find weird because when I was compiling my list, I found 6 of the top 10 players from this era were elite post players. However, the one major outlier of this style was also the 6-time champion of the era.
Yeah.
And then a few other things. The hand checking rules of the era really took speed away and movement from guards, and that also gave centers more of a chance. That's why during this era, a bunch of the good players are centers because they had way more opportunities than the guards did. And also, as we're going to get into in our next video on the early 2000s, the end of the 90s saw a mind-numbingly slow pace, and also eventually bringing into the um, shall we say, dark ages of the NBA from about 1998 to about 2005, where the NBA was slow. It had a very large lack of talent, and there were just a bunch of issues going on with it. Would you agree that the late 90s are the start of that dark age?
Yeah, the 90s, like, especially with the heavy amount of iso ball that was going on near the late 90s, and then that kind of transitioned to the early 2000s, and that's where you have players like Allen Iverson, Kobe Bryant. They kind of thrived in that era,
Yeah,
especially Allen Iverson, because it was an iso ball era, and it was the, like, especially early 2000s, it was kind of that time where no one was really playing team basketball, and there's a lot of
yeah,
deceptively good players just because of the amount of shots that they take.
yeah. The big thing about this era with iso ball is while these players were scoring 25, 20 points a game, they were all doing it inefficiently, and a lot of those teams kind of suffered as a result of their inefficiencies in the scoring perspective.
Yeah, 100% agree.
I would best sum up the 90s as a physical era defined by dominant post players who, despite all the talented big men of the era, were ultimately dominated by the best guard and the best player of all time. And I
Mm-hmm.
would say that the team of the era, the best team from the 1990s, is the 96 Chicago Bulls. They're the quintessential Jordan team. They won, at the time, the most amount of games in the regular season with 72. Now, the 2016 Warriors passed that mark with 73. But at the time, it was an impressive NBA record, and it still is to this day. They had the most valuable player in the league, the sixth man of the league in Toni Kukoc, the coach of the year. They won the NBA title. And all in all, I think this was just a great team. They had great defensive players, great all-around play. They had bench guys who came in, knew their role, and contributed well to the team, as well as having the greatest coach of all time. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean that '96 Bulls team, it was pretty much like a very well crafted team, especially that team during the three-peat. And one thing that a lot of people don't mention is before those players came to the Bulls, they were castaways on their teams.
Yep.
Before Rodman came to the Bulls, no one wanted Dennis Rodman because he was seen as a locker room cancer, and he was just too big of a headache for front offices and the locker rooms.
Yeah.
And then also when it comes to Tony Kukoc, he was he's one of the better six men of all time, and he was one of those players that would perfectly fit into today's game with his combination of shooting and ball handling and passing ability along with his height. Um, Although even if you look at his stats, his shooting numbers aren't as impressive as number like certain players are today, but he was kind of one of the starters when it came to that. And then you also have guys like Steve Kerr and Ron Harper, who are tough, hard nosed players that were able to fit in perfectly with the team.
Yeah. I think a big part of that goes to Phil Jackson's ability to manage his players, because his ability to just take players who maybe they were good in other teams, but they've kind of had a drop off and bring them in and turn them into contributing guys who directly help the Bulls win games during this era. It really goes out to his ability to lead players and also just to manage personalities.
Yeah, and like I think with the triangle offense that the Bulls used, obviously started by Tex Winter and adapted by Phil Jackson, um, like that was really the Bulls were really one of the only teams that actually centered their game around ball movement. There weren't too many
Yeah,
teams that would actively move the ball. Like when I think of like some of the better teams in that era, I think of the Houston Rockets, who kind of just gave it to Hakeem, and Hakeem was kind of that player that would facilitate the whole offense, depending on and like it's the Houston Rockets have kind of been the same for a while. Like the Hakeem Rockets are similar to today's Rockets, where they had a bunch of 3-point shooters,
yeah,
and they revolved around one star. Um, so I get like that's another reason why the Bulls were so dominant.
yeah.
It's a combination of having some of the best players to ever play in that era, as well as having like a very well-run organization.
The other thing about their offensive system is they acknowledged that they didn't have any A plus playmakers like a John Stockton from the era or a Kevin Johnson, but instead they just took advantage of having a bunch of guys like Tony Kukoc, Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan, Steve Kerr that could move the ball well enough to just spread it around. And so by moving the playmaking duties around a bunch of different guys, it really opened up their offense.
Yeah, and I mean their locker room and the whole group of guys. It was a perfect team like for a championship because everyone had a role, everyone bought into that role, and they were able to win 6 rings out of it. I mean, Jordan could have been scoring 40 points per game, right,
Yeah,
during that era, but he didn't need to because it would take away from other players from succeeding, and you kind of need everyone to succeed in order to win, especially in the NBA. And that's why you have Scottie Pippen taking some of the harder defensive matchups as well as moving the ball a little bit more, racking up a little bit more assists. You have Jordan scoring more. You have Steve Kerr on the 3-point line, spacing it out. So it's
yeah.
just a perfect combination.
I think that's a real thing that goes like kind of forgotten about in terms of successful teams. Having players who are unselfish and willingly adapt to their role, and sure they may be sacrificing scoring or rebounding or minutes, but at the same time they don't really care. That's really important for having a championship team. I mean, we saw it with Andre Iguodala in 2015, where for years he had been an all-star, he'd be a perennial starter, and a guy who could lead a team to a playoffs. But by coming off the bench, it really opened up the Warriors' offense, and it led to them winning 3 rings in the end.
Yeah, and another thing is like these players that are on the Bulls are now going to go down as like some of the best role players of all time. Even though before they joined the Bulls, they were struggling to stay in the league. And I feel like um it just shows how great that organization was because not only did they have the greatest player of all time, they also had a perfect fitting system. Like you
Yeah,
have teams like that one Cavs team that had LeBron, Derrick Rose, Dwayne Wade, and Kevin Love. And then they had like Jay Crowder, Isaiah Thomas, all those guys. In theory, that sounds like a stacked lineup, but then when you like break it down, like a bunch of guys like just didn't know their role, and it ended up that team ended up turning into one of the worst teams to ever make it to the finals.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
think.
definitely important that as much as we like to acknowledge Michael Jordan's greatness, we also have to look at his teammates, um,
Yep.
and also Michael Jordan himself in buying into a system that works.
Yeah. For all the, um, shall we say, harsh treatment that Jerry Krause got in The Last Dance, he was the one that really made this team what it was in terms of going out and finding guys like Pippen and for the later runs, Tony Kukoc and Steve Kerr. Without him, is it a team that's built centered around Michael Jordan with pieces that all fit in and are all willing to fit in, or is it a different roster entirely? So for all the harsh treatment he got from Michael Jordan and everyone else in that movie, he really is the guy that made it go in the end and kind of found all the pieces that fit together well and helped them sustain for the better part of the decade their championship success.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the documentary and how Jerry Krause was perceived, I really feel bad for the guy because one, he's not able to defend himself and not really able to talk about what happened. But two, like he came from a baseball system where like baseball has been dominated by the Yankees since its conception. And there was a quote where he said organizations win championships, right?
Yeah,
That quote is kind of embedded in that baseball mindset just
yep,
because organizations win championships in baseball. But I think Jerry Krause had a hard time keeping his ego in check because
yep,
in basketball it's a little bit of both. It's mostly the players that win championships, but organizations go a long way. And I feel like since he was able to draft some of these top tier players with low picks and able to win a bunch of championships, his ego started to get the better of him because as much as Jerry Krause wants to boast about how much players he brought in to help Jordan, Jerry Krause didn't bring Jordan
yep.
in the organization. And that's one thing that he can't take credit for. So it's a little bit of both. Like, in my opinion, I think players are obviously the reason why teams win championships, but you need to have a good person, like developmental personnel, coaching personnel, as well as a good GM to win.
Yeah. The success of a team is predicated on every single layer. Haven't been any NBA champions that have had terrible management staff and have had terrible players or have had bad coaches. You really need a balance between the three levels in order to succeed. And I think that attributing it to just one, it's unfair because it truly is all three levels that help produce winners in the NBA.
I 100% agree.
All right, with that out of the way, we each have assembled our all decade teams, a first, a second, and a third. I will say for this list, especially on my first and second teams, because of the abundance of really talented big men, I've had to move up a lot of players in terms of their positions on the court, where I have, in one case, a center as a small forward. Would you agree that this era kind of had a lot of top heaviness towards their centers in terms of talent?
Yeah, there was a lot of centers. Even when I was creating my list, I was actually kind of shocked how many centers there were. And I actually had to admit some centers,
Yep.
although they are deservingly like the top 15 in the top 15
Yep.
players. Obviously, when it comes to all decade teams, you can't just overload your roster with five centers. So
Yep.
there has to be a balance. And there's some players like, especially when it comes to the point guards, although there's great point guards, the amount of good centers kind of over like outranks the amount of good point guards. And especially for that third team, it was really hard to create a
Yeah.
solid third team.
For me, it was insane going through it because I had to leave off Dikembe Mutombo off my
Yes,
list,
same.
and he's one of the best defensive big men of all time. And during the '90s, I think he was at least a four-time All-Star. He might have won a Defensive Player of the Year.
I think
And
he won three.
having a guy like that, where he's this tremendously talented player, but just because of the sheer magnitude of players of his caliber, you have to leave him off. It's a real indicator towards what kind of era that the '90s were.
Yeah.
All right. With that in mind, would you like to read your first team first, or would you like me to go?
I'll read out my first team.
All right.
So this one, so my point guard is obviously John Stockton. You know,
Yep.
all-time leader in assists. Um, Pretty much the perfect point guard when it comes to having other talented players around you.
Yep.
When I think of guys where it's like you have a bunch of scorers on your team, guys I want running that point guard, I think of John Stockton and Steve Nash,
Yep.
and Chris Paul. And like you know, he was a great defender. I think he's the all-time steals
Yeah.
leader.
Yep.
And I was watching some of his highlights. He was scrappy. He was willing to put his body on the line.
Yeah.
He took multiple charges, and he's also an underrated finisher.
Yep.
Um,
I think with him, because of how good he was at playmaking and defense, I think his scoring ability goes a little under the radar because while he didn't put up much points, he didn't really need to, and he definitely could when he had to for the Jazz in terms of playoff series.
yeah, and I mean when it comes down to performing in the biggest moments, although he never won a finals series, obviously because he was going against Michael Jordan,
Yep.
he had some very clutch moments in his career, especially
Yeah.
that one shot against Houston
Yeah.
where Charles Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon were on the same team. He had a buzzer beater or a near buzzer beater to end the game. I mean, as a point guard, in that era where people weren't scoring as much, that's definitely like something incredible you'd want to have.
Yeah. Well, that whole team did kind of underperform in the finals, which is something we'll talk about in a minute. He didn't come up completely short. He still gave in good performances throughout. So while the Utah Jazz teams, they did come up short in the end, largely due to the failings in the playoff of another player, it wasn't necessarily Stockton's fault by any means.
Yeah, and then obviously at shooting guard, I think we both have this player, Michael Jordan. I mean, we like it goes without saying, like he's the greatest player of all time. Won
Yep.
6 championships. He won a couple scoring championships during that decade. Um, and he's also the all-time leader in points per game.
Yep.
Doesn't get better than that.
I don't think he can really.
So then my small forward is Scottie Pippen, obviously Jordan's sidekick. This one he's kind of debatable. A lot of people debate whether Scottie Pippen was good because he was Scottie Pippen and he was just that good, or if it's because of Jordan. I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Obviously, having Jordan, a bunch of your shots get taken away just because of how good he is at scoring. But I
Yeah.
think when you look at other parts of Scotty's game, like his defense and his playmaking ability, especially at his size, those
Yep.
are things that weren't really common in that era. And still, it's just starting to get common now. Like you have guys like Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, doing those types of things. Scottie Pippen's kind of right in there,
Yeah.
and also his athleticism is insane.
Yeah. With Pippen, in the 2 seasons between Jordan's first retirement and his return in 95, in that first year, he was second in MVP voting. And if I'm not mistaken, he averaged something like 23, 8, and 6. So I think that season is a real demonstration of if he was on a team where he was the lone star, he wouldn't have had the success by any means that he did with the Bulls. But at the same time, he would have been a top 5, top 7 player in the league. And so I think because of his status as you said, Michael Jordan's sidekick, he would have been better without Jordan, but at the same time, he was still a tremendous player in his own right. And without him, they don't win 6 championships like they do with him.
Yeah, definitely. So then my power forward, you might disagree with me on this one, but it's Carl Malone.
Yeah,
Um, Obviously he had a bunch of shortcomings in the finals, but that was also multiple Hall of Famers in
yeah,
this era. Second place in all-time scoring,
yep,
and just like him and Stockton were a really good duo. I mean, a bunch of Stockton's assists came from dishing Carl Malone right underneath the basket.
yeah,
He was really athletic. He also had a pretty good mid-range game.
yep. He was kind of ahead of his time with the pick and pop in Stockton in that aspect where a lot of big men would just go to the rim, but with him, he could shoot a 15, 20 footer and he could do it efficiently too.
Yeah, and he was also definitely a great role man as well.
Yeah.
Um, he
With,
he kind
with
of could have
me,
done it all.
yeah, with me, I have him on my first team, but I cheat a little. I have Jordan at point, Scottie Pippen at the 2, Malone at the 4, and then I move a power forward up to 3. But he is one of the 5 best players in this era where a lot of guys were one time in the finals and then you're done for the decade. He made it twice. He he did come up short in a lot of playoff series, but at the same time, I mean, he still did have good series in terms of stats. His efficiency was always reduced a bit, but it wasn't so drastic that he just fell off a cliff by any means. He was still a good player, even in those moments where he came up short. And I think that all in all, he is him and Charles Barkley, I'd say, the best power forwards from this era. He was a great scorer, was never a great defender, but that's not what the Jazz needed. And he made the finals twice in an era where it was really competition, a lot of competition in the West, where he had to go against a lot of good talent. And I think because of that, he deserves first team for this decade.
Yeah, and then my center, it's Hakeem Olajuwon, another player
Yep.
that goes without saying. He's probably the second best player in that era, and he
Yep.
was only one of like I'd like to say like two other top 10 players in
Yeah,
that era to win a championship.
definitely. Yeah.
Um, and he won 2 rings out of the other three
Yeah.
teams that were not named the Chicago Bulls.
Now, I always say that Hakeem is the second best center of all time in terms of talent. Would you agree with that?
Who do you have first?
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But I
Kareem?
think that with him, he gets the nod. Now I know Wilt and Russell have all these records and all these scoring records for Wilt and the rebounding records for both of them and the titles for Russell, but they played in an era where they didn't have too much competition. But I think with Hakeem, in terms of talent, it's him or Kareem for sure. He arguably had the most finesse on post moves and the amazing footwork of any center of all time. He had amazing ability to make a hook, make a turnaround jump shot. Obviously, the dream shake where he'd go up and under again. Fantastic move, and he really pioneered a big man's mobility in the paint, where a lot of guys, when you think of them, are just get the ball, shoot a hook, kind of power your way in. With him, it was more of an art form. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, in my opinion, when I think of like the most skilled big man, I think Hakeem's actually number one.
Yeah,
Just because, like, I'm not bashing Kareem here because obviously he's an all-time great, won multiple championships, and he's also number one
yep,
all-time in scoring. But I think when you talk about skill and footwork, especially for a center,
yep,
Hakeem could do it all.
yep.
When I look at a lot of Kareem's early footage,
Just a lot
it,
of ducks, right?
it's a lot of dunks. It's a lot of just muscling your way in through like ugly turnaround layups.
Yep,
Just using his size over him, and then
yeah,
he had the sky hook, which a lot of people say, oh, why don't people do it in today's game? I mean, that's one of the hardest shots to make because you're not necessarily looking at the ball when you're shooting it,
yep,
like your hands behind your head,
yep,
and it's just pure muscle memory.
yeah,
And it's not like Kareem was doing sky hooks from 3 feet. He was doing them from like 10 to 15 feet sometimes.
yep.
So I guess when you talk about that shot, I definitely would give it to Kareem. But when you look at everything else, just Hakeem's ability to shoot mid ranges,
Yep.
his ability to shoot post fades at a high level, and then also his like ability on the defensive end. Um, when it
I
comes to skill and
yeah,
not just overall greatness, he's probably number one for me.
I would say he's the best defensive player, regardless of position in NBA history for sure. I think he's all time number one on blocks for his career. I'm pretty sure his all time defensive averages are around 3 blocks a game and 1.5 steals per game, which is insane when you say it out loud. And the other thing about him is his 2 final runs in 1994 and 1995 in this era. If you look at them from the Rockets seeding, especially in 95, where they were the 6th seed, and who they had to play in each of their series, it's really insane how, while he had talent on his team and he had good shooters, especially in 94, he didn't really have a top 40 player next to him. So his ability to dominate all these other good teams and do it twice without Michael Jordan, it's really a testament to just how good he was as a player.
Yeah, and one thing a lot of people do talk about when it comes to the Rockets in the 90s is, oh, Jordan never faced the Rockets, and the Rockets were his hardest team to beat. And I guess
Yep.
like it's kind of true, although as we talk later on the podcast, Jordan still had to beat a bunch of good teams, not only during the Eastern Conference playoffs, but also in the finals. But
Yep.
that matchup, Hakeem versus Jordan, I'm pretty sure the Jordan was negative against the Rockets
Yeah.
throughout his career, which that's the only team he's negative in. So that would have
I,
been an interesting matchup to see.
I think it would have been the most interesting matchup of the 90s. And along with LeBron versus Kobe, it's probably the greatest never happened series. The thing about Jordan's finals, which we'll talk about in a little, is he did play amazing players and Hall of Famers multiple times in the playoffs, but he never really went against a really good rim protector. So I think, and I think this is another thing we'll touch on in a hypothetical in a little while. If he went against Hakeem, who is the best shot blocker of all time and is this fantastical defensive center, would he have been able to get to the rim as much as he would have against guys like Sam Perkins on the Lakers?
Yeah, definitely. That's an interesting topic to touch on.
Yeah. I think he still would have been able to succeed because of his ability to shoot from mid range. But would Hakeem have been able to pester him and especially pester Scottie Pippen enough to the point where the Rockets could at least make it 7 games or maybe even win the series?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say because when you like think of Jordan,
Yeah.
like I don't really know that Rockets roster too well, so I don't
Yeah.
know how many elite perimeter defenders they have. But
Yeah.
depending on if they did have any great perimeter defenders that they could stick on Jordan, it definitely would be tough because not only would Jordan have to get past him, you have Hakeem as that second layer that would prevent him from doing as much as he would against, like you said, like a Sam Perkins or a Karl Malone or Greg Ostertag, like those types of players who aren't really seen as elite rim protectors.
Yeah.
But it also depends on when he's facing them. I feel like if it was Jordan in during his first three-peat, I think the Bulls would have a much easier time,
Yeah.
just because they also had bigger players, like bigger bigs, like
Yeah.
Horace Grant,
Yeah.
that could give Hakeem problems. But I think Jordan was also a little bit more athletic during his first three-peat than his second.
Yep.
So that athleticism would have been able to push him over the edge.
Yeah. I think with the second repeat, Hakeem, especially in the second one, like you said, the second three-peat Bulls, their big men were Rodman, who was a great defender, but he's only, 6'6", and then it was Luke Longley and a bunch of other middling centers. So Hakeem, in that instance, definitely would have dominated the Bulls at least. So I think that's one of the most interesting matchups where Jordan and Pippen's getting to the rim would be halted by Hakeem, but would their overall talent still push them over the top?
Yeah. And but you also have to think about it this way. Like the Jazz were able to beat the Rockets
Yeah.
um as well. So and the Jazz, other than Karl Malone, didn't really have a big that was scary either. So like obviously this is terrible logic to be like, oh, this team beat them, so that means that other team must beat them. But
Yeah.
like just to give you a comparable, for example, of a team that actually beat them, um, their two best players were John Stockton and Karl Malone, and
Yeah.
I'm sure um, I'm not too sure exactly what Stockton's numbers were, but if Stockton could get past Hakeem, then I'm sure Jordan could too.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting scenario, though, for sure. So that's your first team. My first team is, like I said, I don't do it where I have a point guard and a traditional lineup. For me, it's Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Karl Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, and then at the small forward, I have Charles Barkley. Barkley, other than the Pacers in '98, I would say was the greatest threat to Jordan in this era in terms of final series. A lot of people, including Shaquille O'Neal mostly, say that Barkley choked during this era. He really didn't. If you look at his series, especially in 1993 when the Phoenix Suns made the finals, he really gave the Bulls a fight. It's not like he just receded and choked and gave away possessions and played worse than he normally does. he had dominant games himself, and it's just a testament where he was amazing throughout the 90s. His best few years were at the start where he wins the MVP award and he makes the finals. But just because of Michael Jordan, he really isn't able to get over the top.
Yeah, I had Barkley on my second team.
Yeah.
Actually, at small forward too, but just different reasons why I prefer to have a point guard instead of Michael Jordan running the point.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely that's another alternative. Especially if you want to talk about the five best players in that era.
Yeah.
I think those five are the best players.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we go on to the second team now?
Yes, we shall. I'll go first. So for me, I have Stockton at point guard. Like we said, all-time assist leader, all-time steals leader, made the finals twice. Just a really good player throughout the era. At my shooting guard, I have Clyde Drexler. He made the finals 3 times in this era, twice as a Blazer, and then in '95 with the Rockets, where he won a title. And while these days a lot of people just remember him as the guy who got shrugged against Michael Jordan in 1992, he was a really good player. He was this amazing slasher who kind of had this Russell Westbrook ability to get to the rim and throw over anyone, regardless of height. And during the time, there were a lot of narratives where it was Jordan versus Drexler. Now we all know today, and even back then, that Jordan is the far better player. But but Drexler was definitely talented enough where he got people thinking about whether or not this was a real thing. So I think his talent and the fact that he was a successful player in an era with a bunch of other good teams where he made the finals 3 times and he won one, I think that gives him the nod on the second team.
Yeah, I mean, Clyde the Glide was definitely a great player. I don't
Yeah,
have him on my second team, he's on my third team.
yeah,
But one thing I want to touch on is that the reason why the Blazers didn't draft Jordan was because of Drexler.
yep,
Um, because they had Clyde and they saw no need for Mike to draft Michael Jordan. That's why they drafted Sam Bowie.
yep,
Um, so he was definitely a great player, like you said, 2 times in the finals.
yep.
Um, and he just came up short against the Pistons and the Bulls. But
Eventually got that ring with Houston. And I think that it definitely was one of the biggest what ifs of all time, where what if Portland does draft Jordan and they have Drexler and Jordan? Because a lot of teams during this era really fell into the mindset where if you have a player at one position, you cannot draft another player at that position, which is it's really narrow minded and it's just inconsiderate of talent where sure they play at the same position, but maybe you could move one to another position. And if they're the best player available, even if they can't play with the guys you already have, you could just trade one of them later on, like what the Sixers did in the trust the process era, where they drafted a bunch of centers that were at the top of the board. They found one who is an all NBA talent, and they traded the other ones to make room for him.
yeah, um, and then also like one, I completely forgot that Clyde won the ring with Houston, so I might
Yeah,
have to bump him up on my second team now. But a
yeah.
question I do have for you is: do you think if the Blazers drafted Jordan, and him and Clyde went on to win multiple rings, because the Blazers still had a solid team around them um,
Yeah,
during that time, do you think the way we view Scotty today would be the same way as we view Clyde?
I think it would definitely be very similar. Where they will always be in Michael Jordan's shadow, and I think from an all-time perspective, they'd be ranked the same. You'd still look at their individual talent and recognize them for what they are, but at the same time, I do think that if it was situational where it was Drexler and Jordan, and they theoretically do go on to win 6 rings, I definitely think that it would be the viewpoint where Drexler and Pippen's career narratives are switched. But the other thing is, if the Bulls don't have Jordan, do the Seattle Supersonics trade Scottie Pippen, or do they keep him and keep him with Gary Payton and Sean Kemp for the 90s? And if they do that, how good are they?
Yeah, there's a bunch of hypotheticals with every situation.
Of course.
Um, Personally, I think that team would be regarded as one of the greatest defensive teams of all time.
Yeah.
Um, because you have two premier defenders. Obviously, for the Bulls, they had three premier defenders in Jordan, Pippen, and Broadman. And I think during that year, all three players came top 10 in Defensive Player of the Year voting.
Yep.
You had Jordan, who's always in the top 3 to 5, Pippen, who's always in like the top 3 to 5
Yeah.
as well, and then Rodman, who's kind of near the end of the list during his Bulls tenure. So
Yeah.
definitely interesting to see. And then just the athleticism that the whole team would have,
Yeah.
especially with Sean Kemp and Scotty. And you also have a point forward in Scotty that could throw lobs to Kemp.
Yeah.
He could also receive lobs from Peyton. Who
Yeah.
knows?
I think
Maybe that would be the first lob city.
I think that would be a really, if maybe if even if they didn't win, that'd definitely be one of the funnest teams to watch from a viewer perspective, where you have all these dunks, you have Gary Payton, who's one of the best trash talkers of all time, and now with Pippen, he can definitely back it up with multiple playoff series wins.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure Tom Chambers spent a year or a couple years on Seattle as well. And Tom Chambers is a player I want to talk about later, especially when we go down to like some of the best plays
Yeah.
of all time.
Yeah.
Um, like he's a very underrated athlete.
He jumped over a guy, am I correct?
Mark Jackson. I was actually going to talk about that play. We'll talk about that later.
Yep.
But I mean, that roster put Tom Chambers and Detlef Schrempf. I mean, this your bench would already be
Yeah.
stacked,
His
let
Schrempf
alone the starting lineup.
Because Schrempf is a six man of the year winner. So if they could run almost a Warriors 5 where you run maybe Pippen at the 4 and Kemp at the 5, like 15 years ahead of the Warriors, 20 years ahead. And if they do that, do they win titles even with Jordan and Drexler? So I think Jordan going to Portland instead of Sam Bowie, that opens up a lot of really interesting scenarios and a lot of really interesting ideas.
Or what you could do is you could fit with the time back then and just have a huge lineup of Peyton, Pippen, Schrempf,
Yeah.
Kemp, and then whoever your center is. Then have
Yep.
Tom Chambers coming off the bench. That would definitely be another interesting thing to see.
Yeah. Anyways, moving on with my second team. When I said there were a lot of good centers, I meant it. So with my second team, I kind of threw in the three of the better centers in the era. I put them all in the second team kind of thing. I really went by just who I think are the best players from this era instead of position. So at small forward, I have the 7-foot Patrick Ewing from the New York Knicks. Now, he was always in Jordan's shadow as the Knicks, who always got crushed by Jordan. He was a good player. He was always about 20 and 10, really good low post guy. Took his team to the finals once where they came up short in, I believe, 7 games against the Houston Rockets. But as far as talented players of this era goes, he's definitely up there with guys like Hakeem and guy I'll talk about in a minute, David Robinson, in terms of his ability to score and lead a team to wins.
Yeah, Ewing is on my third team. Um, but yeah, Ewing, one of the most athletic centers of all time,
Yep.
premier shot blocker. And before he came into the league, he was really hyped as the guy that would transcend the NBA. And
Yeah,
although, I mean, the NBA allegedly rigged a draft for him, so which
that's
is
a
another thing that we could talk about.
That
But
I was going to say, topic for another video. But I think with him, a lot of the reason people don't remember him as fondly as you'd hope is just because when he was coming in the NBA, like you said, he was supposed to be this transcendent player, but he never really hit the expectations that people set for him.
yeah, and I mean, if you compare him to some of the other centers on this list,
Yeah.
David Robinson, he won a ring. Shaq won a ring,
Yep.
multiple. Hakeem won multiple rings.
Yep.
Patrick Ewing's the odd man out, and he's kind of that one guy that never really had team success,
Yeah.
especially where your legacy is based off winning.
Yeah.
He wasn't really a winner,
Yeah.
so to
The
speak.
one the one real chance he had aside from the 94 series was when the Knicks made the finals in 99, but then he gets hurt halfway through the playoff run and they fall flat in the finals. So I think that with him a big part of it is you look at Hakeem and David Robinson and at times when he was motivated Shaq, they were elite rim protectors. Meanwhile, Ewing, he could always block a shot, but he was never really a lockdown center by any means.
Yeah.
Anyways, after Patrick Ewing, I have a guy we were talking about before, David Robinson. In this era, he was like a slightly worse version of Hakeem Olajuwon. He was a really good post player, had some decent post moves, good rebounder, and he was also a very elite defender. I believe he won Defensive Player of the Year during this era. And like Ewing, big reason he's kind of forgotten about is just because until Tim Duncan came, he really didn't have any success in the playoffs. Before Duncan came and became the best player on the Spurs, he had no finals series appearances. He always got knocked off fairly early in the playoffs. So, but all in all, he was just a really talented player during this era, and so that's why I think he should be on the second team.
Yeah, he was also on my second team.
Yep. And then lastly, on my second team, I have Shaq. During the 90's, it was kind of, he was a really different player than what he was in LA, especially during the Magic years. While a lot of people remember Shaq as a really slow, bruising guy, in Orlando, he was running fast breaks and he was getting up the court quickly, and he had a lot of maneuverability that slowed as he went to LA. But at the same time, he was always a dominant player who could push around anyone in the post, good defender, good rebounder. And a lot of people forget that he did take a team to a final series in 1996. Not 1996, but 1995, and he even beat Michael Jordan, and is the only player to beat Michael Jordan in his prime.
Yeah. Shaq on Orlando was a pretty athletic dude. Him and Penny Hardaway on the same team, two athletes. That's something I definitely wish I was alive to see.
Yeah, that would have
Um,
been fun.
and also, a bunch of things people don't really talk about Shaq is back like in his high school days, he was a tight end in football.
Yep.
And he could have been one of the better, if not one of the greatest tight ends in the NFL,
Yep.
just because of his size and speed. And I think once Shaq went to the Lakers, and especially during his later years, the weight kind of just piled on, and
Yeah.
Shaq was like focused on becoming just a bulldozer that can just knock down anyone in his path
Yeah.
instead of being one of those athletes that can run the floor and um,
Yeah.
be mobile.
I think that switch from an athlete to a really big, like low post guy, that's really what led to his success. Because when in LA, he realized that if I get on the block and me at 300 pounds is in the post and there's no one that can stop me, that really led to his success in the playoffs against teams that had smaller big men trying to guard him.
Yeah, but the only thing that like I kind of disagree with you is like that was also a detriment in his career when it
Yeah.
comes to his longevity
Yep.
because um when you think of the greats, especially the ones that come in the 2000s and 2010s, one thing that we focus on is their longevity.
Yeah.
Um, because I feel like Shaq, Kobe, and LeBron, they're all kind of in this one little pocket of players that were great in the 2000s, um, and it's their Shaq and I mean LeBron and Kobe's longevity is what kind of makes their careers and
Yeah.
puts them in where they are in the all-time rankings.
Yeah. I think it's weird though, where Shaq, even in his 13th season in Miami, where he wins the title, he was still a dominant player. And when you compare him to guys like Ewing and Hakeem, they really had 10-year bursts. But with Shaq, he was still an all-star in Phoenix. So I think that in terms of his ability to win at later ages was reduced. But at the same time, he was still a productive player, even going on his later days. And he had more longevity than a bunch of other centers from this era too.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, even the year before he won the championship in 2005, he was second in MVP voting behind Steve Nash.
Yep.
So he was still a good player once he left LA, but he was never that player that people remember Shaq as.
Yeah. So that was my second team. Do you have any changes to make?
So for my second team, um, it's a little different. I put Ewing on my third team. I originally had Reggie Miller at my two, but I'm going to replace him with Clyde Drexler
Yep.
because I completely forgot he won a championship, and he was also able to be the main guy to take his team to the finals.
Yep.
Obviously, both him and Reggie Miller had the same result when they were the main guy in the finals, and they got beaten by Michael Jordan. but Reggie was in the conference finals.
Yep.
At my 3, I have Charles Barkley.
Yep.
At my 4, I have David Robinson, and at my 5, I have Shaq.
So we have the same guys as except for Ewing. Who is your point guard?
Gary Payton.
Okay. I have Payton on my third team. I think that with Payton, he was the leader of those Sonic teams that were able to make the finals. He's probably him. It's either him or Chris Paul as best defensive point guards of all time. To this day, he's the only point guard who has won Defensive Player of the Year, if I'm correct. And he was a tremendous talent for sure. I think that with him and Stockton, the only difference really between the two is Stockton's longevity as a player, where he had 15 really high level years, whereas Payton had about 8 or 9. But I think that those two are definitely interchangeable with each other for their peaks. With Payton, he came up short in Seattle because he played Michael Jordan. And also, there were a few years where they were the heavy favorites, such as when they played Denver in 1994, but then they lost in the first round as a 1 seed. So I think he definitely had some of the best highs of the 90s, but at the same time, he had a really big low, especially with that loss to Denver in the first round.
I mean, when I think of Gary Payton, I think of like just a resilient player.
Yep.
Um, Especially like during his early years, he wasn't really producing as well, and he was a top 3 pick. I think he was number 2 as well. And one thing, like one number 2 pick that's been disappointing, that's starting to make a rise is Lonzo Ball.
Yep.
And I feel like a lot of the Lonzo fans, they kind of turned to Gary Payton as like an inspiration that he can get back on track.
Yeah.
Because they had similar production, Ball a little bit better, but they're pretty similar in certain aspects when it
Yeah.
comes to being defensive minded.
Yeah. In terms of play style, I think the comparison between the two is there. But at the same time, I think, especially with Payton, he has a lot more mental toughness than Lonzo Ball does. So I think that while it's a decent comparison in terms of how they play the game, I think that Payton in the end will definitely have a better career than Lonzo Ball will.
Oh yeah, that goes without saying. I mean, Lonzo Ball hasn't really proved anything
Yeah.
yet. Obviously, he's in his 3rd season, so um,
Still time.
there's still time, of course. And then yeah, other than that, I had Charles Barkley at the 3.
Yep.
But other than that, not too many differences. So then
Okay.
for my 3rd team, before I mention my 3rd team, I just want to make a correction. When I said Tom Chambers would be on that Seattle team, I
Yep.
got the timelines mixed up. Tom Chambers played for Seattle during the 80s and never the 90s, so that's my fault. But um, he did play on the Phoenix Suns during the 90s, but he's not going to be on the list. But one
Yeah.
Sun that is going to be on the list at point guard is Kevin Johnson.
Yeah.
I mean, he's kind of one of the first uber athletic point guards
Yeah.
we've seen in the NBA.
Yeah.
And he's kind of like the inspiration to guys like Westbrook, John
Yeah.
Wall, all that. Just a great player. Never
Yeah.
really won anything when it comes to like team wise,
Yeah.
but a solid player.
Yeah.
Another player that I was thinking of adding was Tim Hardaway, but it's kind of hard to compare the two. Or
Yeah.
Penny Hardaway. There's a lot of great point guards.
Yep.
But I think Kevin Johnson's the most deserving.
Yep.
The next player I have is Reggie Miller. Because I did the switch. Obviously, Reggie, one of the most clutch players.
Yep.
Even though he wasn't able to make a finals appearance or
Yep.
even win a championship, I feel like he was definitely a great shooter. Would fit perfectly in today's NBA.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to his mental toughness and his overall ability to compete,
Yep.
it's up there with some of the greats.
Yeah. I have a few notes on Reggie. I think that he's one of the oddest players in terms of how people view him, because these days he's depicted as being overrated. But while he was a player, in terms of his appearances in the All-Star game and how people thought of him, he was really underrated. I mean, in a 18-year career, he only had 5 All-Star appearances and 3 All-NBAs, despite having a career scoring average of around 20 points. I mean, he was a really efficient player in an era of inefficient basketball from guards. He was the leading scorer on teams that regularly made deep playoff runs in terms of conference finals, a finals appearance in 2000, and they probably would have made a finals appearance in 2005 if not for an unforeseen event that occurred early in the season. But with him during his era, he was really disrespected by the NBA in terms of you had guys like Steve Smith, who were obviously good players, but they were regularly making All-Star games over Reggie Miller, which is not exactly, looking back on it, not exactly right. But like you said, if he was in today's NBA, he'd be in that kind of Bradley Beal role where he'd be a tremendous scorer who could take your team to a certain amount of wins, and especially in his era, in an era emphasized by the talent of the center position and rules like hand checking that prevented guards from really showcasing their talents, he was still able to lead teams to wins on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I mean when Michael Jordan's asked about like players that gave him the hardest time, he talks about Reggie Miller and the
Yep.
Pacers, and um, especially during Michael Jordan's last playoff run,
Yep.
the Pacers were probably the team that gave him the most problems
They're
while he was winning
yeah.
championships.
Aside from Shaq in '95, I think they're the only team who took him to Game 7.
Yeah, yeah. Which I mean, when you said Bradley Beal, I definitely agree when it comes to scoring, but
Yeah,
when it
not in terms
comes to
of
like taking your team to the next level,
definitely.
and being a number one option that with another like one being put in another circumstance could definitely
Definitely.
take the team
Yep.
to the finals.
Yep.
Um, I mean, he's a really solid player, and before this 2010 era, he was looked at as either the best or second best shooter of all time.
Yeah. Only now with guys like Steph Curry and Klay Thompson that he's kind of faded. But at the same time, for a guy who only attempted 5 threes a game for his career, which is half of what Steph Curry does, he's still second all time as of now on the all time 3 point shooting list. He will fall behind Curry likely in the next year or two. I think next year, I think he's pretty close. But at the same time, for a guy who didn't take too many threes, he was still an amazing shooter at around 40% for his career.
Yeah,
All right.
and then
Who's your small
um,
forward?
my small forward.
Yeah.
This one was a little tricky for me. I wasn't too sure who to put. So I went on Basketball Reference, kind of played around with it,
Yeah.
and I saw Grant Hill.
Yeah.
Um, and he was a guy. I mean, he kind of was that one guy that he could have he could have been a very solid player for his like whole career.
Yeah.
And he kind of had a early first like 5 or 6 seasons where he was great, and
Yep.
then he kind of fell off due to injury,
Yep.
which is natural. I mean, in the last season of the decade, he scored 26 points.
Yep.
So, I mean, when it comes down to small forwards, the list kind of gets a little watered down later
Yeah.
on, and there's a bunch of players you could pick. That's at the three.
Yep.
But Grant Hill's
I was going to talk about Grant Hill during our underrated portion, but I might as well do it now. For his first 6 seasons in Detroit, he averaged 22, 8, and 6, which is like Scottie Pippen-esque numbers where he could control an offense, grab a board on one end, and then go down and score on the other. Like Scottie, and also like kind of like Braun in his early years in Cleveland, he really had an ability to handle the ball from the perimeter and slash to the paint and get in and score against tougher defenders. He was really good at drawing fouls at about 8 free throw attempts throughout his first 6 seasons in the league. And he was also a capable defender. He averaged 1.5 steals in his few years in Detroit. And his highest season for win shares is higher than Kobe Bryant's, who was a 15-time all defender. So I think that Hill in this era, he was really of the Pippen mold of a really good point forward who could lead your team to a playoff series. However, like you said, in the 4 years after that 26-point game season in Detroit, he only played 44 games for the next 4 years. So it's really unfortunate that he never really got to hit his prime because of those injuries. So it would have been interesting to see how he would have fared with him and Tracy McGrady on that Orlando Magic teams in the early years, where you have this combination of tall wings who can score and move the ball as well. So it's really unfortunate that he had to get injured, and we really couldn't see what he could have become.
Yeah, like you said, you touched on T Mac. Him and Grant Hill were supposed to be one of those duos that would be unstoppable,
Yep,
especially as when you have T Mac, who is a great scorer,
yep,
could score almost everywhere on the court, and also a great athlete, combined with um, Grant Hill, who is kind of like you said, the Scottie Pippen mold as a point forward on offense.
yep,
That was basically just a step lower than Jordan and Pippen. But then
yep,
obviously Grant Hill got injured, and then you could also always question, what if he never left Detroit? Um,
yep,
He'd also be seen as a multiple time champion. Obviously, certain players wouldn't be on that roster
yeah,
um, in the early 2000s, but it's another
yeah,
thing you could consider.
yep. Your power forward for the third team selection is
Okay, so this one I put Sean Kemp.
yep,
Um, Although it could have easily been Dikembe Mutombo.
yep,
Um, the reason why I put Sean Kemp just because he was an electrifying player. And then obviously when it comes down to the 90's, I was never there to see um, the players play.
yeah,
Obviously, I know that there's a bunch of centers like Alonzo Mourning that were great during this era as well,
yep.
um, in this decade. But when I think of Sean Kemp, I just think of that one dunk, um,
The
where
pointing, right?
yeah, against the Warriors, where he dunked it, destroyed the guy standing underneath the paint, and he just squatted and pointed at him.
Yep.
Um, Definitely one of my favorite plays, and highlight plays to watch.
Yeah, I think that play really summarizes his game where he was this amazing athlete. He could dunk over anyone, and he would rub it in your face when he did it.
Yeah, and I mean, you also have to give credit where credit's due. Him and Payton were able to bring their teams to the finals,
Yeah,
in an era where not too many players were able to make it to that point.
yeah,
Um, and I feel like it just longevity is another reason why he isn't talked about as one of the greats,
yep,
just because he didn't play long enough. And once he got traded from Seattle, he kind of just lost motivation in basketball and lost his passion. He
yep.
started gaining a ton of weight. And then by the time he was on Orlando, he was looking like Oliver Miller and um, and just
Former
was useless.
former Raptor Oliver Miller.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, after he went to Cleveland, I've heard stories of drug addiction, I think, where he just kind of took a turn for the worst after being traded. But nonetheless, in his prime in Seattle, he was a really good player. And he was kind of like Blake Griffin, where if you gave him the ball on a fast break, get out of the way.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people compared Zion to this guy.
Yeah,
Um, Obviously, the similarities are there. Two guys that are a little undersized for their position. I'm not too sure how tall Sean Kemp was. I believe he was 6'8", um,
yeah,
something like that. Um, and can really jump out of the gym. Um, Obviously, we don't know where Zion's going to take us because if judging by his first couple of games, Zion's looking like a real talented player. But if Zion's ceiling was prime Sean Kemp, I'm not complaining.
no,
It would be a little bit of a disappointment, but I'm not complaining.
yeah. I mean, you take a player like Kemp in any situation, and I think that stylistically, if you need a kind of a comparison to what those guys played like, the Blake Griffin, Chris Paul, it's really similar where you have this electrifying point guard who can play defense and talks a lot of trash, and then you have a big man who can score in the post and can dunk the ball like no tomorrow.
Yeah, and then obviously there was other players like we talked about later, like with Shrem.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Sean Kemp is my power forward, and then
Yep.
at my center I have Patrick Ewing.
Yep.
Um, he's another player that goes without saying. Like we already talked about Ewing, great player, um, great individual career, but just didn't have the team success that a lot of people look at
Yep.
in order to take him to the next level.
Yep. For me, I have Gary Payton on my third team. Like we said, Reggie Miller. I agree with Sean Kemp. Since I already put Ewing, I put Alonzo Mourning in. Really good player, amazing defender, solid rebounder, good scorer. Didn't really have too much success in this era, but he eventually won a title in 2006 with Gary Payton as a good sixth man, so he gets the nod for me. And then at my point guard, I have Penny Hardaway. I think him, Kevin Johnson, and Tim Hardaway, they're really interchangeable where they were these great players, but especially with Johnson and Hardaway, Penny Hardaway, that is, they had really short primes where, because of injuries, they only had 5 years of real success. But at the same time, during Penny's years of stardom, he made the finals with Shaq, was a really electrifying player. He got a lot of comparisons to Magic Johnson at the time for his ability to move the ball, score in the paint, and be the 6'7" point guard. So I think because of that, he gets the nod for me over Kevin Johnson. But at the same time, they're both really interchangeable.
Yeah. And then also Tim Hardaway, he kind of had a run when he was on the Warriors, and also a little bit when he was on the Heat,
Yep.
where he scored like 23 and 10,
Yep.
which is incredible, especially at that time. One thing a lot of people disrespect the 90's for is like their point guards,
Yeah.
because there wasn't a bunch of point guards that were putting up numbers that people are putting up in today's game.
Yeah.
And it's just a shame to see, because right now the point guard is less focused and fixated on facilitating the offense as
Yeah.
they are scoring.
Yeah. This is my thing with the modern NBA. In terms of real point guards, there aren't too many. There are more combo guards where they're more about scoring and occasionally moving the ball than they are about running an offense. But back in that day, there were a lot of traditional guys like Tim Hardaway and John Stockton, where the priority is setting up the offense, and them getting their shot, it comes second in terms of the hierarchy of their abilities.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to see what numbers those point guards would put up if
Yeah.
the mindset was switched.
Yeah.
I definitely think Stockton would go down as a guy that would score 25 points per game if he was only getting like 8 assists, especially in some of those years where he was getting as much as 14 assists per game. That's
Yeah.
a lot of passes to give up.
Yeah.
That could have been potential shots.
I think Kevin Johnson especially benefits from it, and Tim Hardaway as well, where they could score and get 10 assists a game at the same time. So if you took away a few of those assists and gave them, I don't know, 4 or 5 more shots, how would that impact their scoring average? I think with those two especially, it would definitely see a hike in scoring.
Yeah, and Penny Hardaway as well. Like those three guys, Kevin Johnson and Penny Hardaway were like the athletes of
Yeah.
that decade at the point guard position. So it would be interesting to see. Obviously, another thing is you can't really compare the 90's to now because it's just two completely different brands of basketball.
Yep.
I mean, when you compare era to era, you can't compare the 90's on the standards that are being put in today's game. You can't really compare the players to that standard because every era is different. Every era had a certain thing that they were good at, if not better at than other eras.
Yep.
And of course, like this era, which we didn't really talk about, we barely touched on with the hand checking. This era was more physicality. And one thing I want to talk about, because we're basically done our all NBA teams, is I want to talk about the rivalries that some teams had, and how players in this era played with a genuine passion for basketball. And even when it came to rivalries, like these rivalries aren't like what we see today, where it's like, oh, we saw you guys in the finals, so it's a rivalry, or oh, we play in the same city, so it's a rivalry. These rivalries were literally, we hate you.
Yeah.
We can't stand you.
What would you say is the most violent rivalry from this decade?
There's a lot. One that I want to say is the Miami Heat and New York Knicks.
Yep. I think that the culmination of the brawl where Jeff Van Gundy is grabbing, I want to say, Alonzo Mourning's leg, that really summarized it, where you had Larry Johnson for the Knicks and Alonzo Mourning for the Heat, who were former teammates. But because of circumstances, 5 years later, they're getting in a fist fight with each other in a playoff series. I think that just the intensity, like the physical style, it really impacted the rivalries, where because of the grinding down battles in the post, a lot of players got frustrated with one another pretty easily. And so because of that, there were a lot of like upscaled fights like the Nixon Heat rivalry.
Yeah, and even when you think about that, like Pat Riley switching sides
Yeah.
from New York to Miami, like
Yeah.
it just like that combination. I mean, you could search it up on YouTube, man. Like the fights are like brutal. Like
Yeah.
they want each other's heads.
Yep.
And another thing, like I think you have to give credit to the Bad Boy Pistons because
Yeah.
even though they were in the '80s, they were kind of like those guys were kind of like they just wanted to fight everybody,
Yeah.
um, and they were kind of like the start of that like physical mindset.
Yeah. They say it themselves, they really took away from the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird era of flash and scoring. And they really were the start, like you said, of we're going to get down and we're going to take you out, and that's going to get us to winning games.
Yeah, and then even when it comes down to like little physical battles, you always think of Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone getting into that little thing, like Dennis Rodman basically like just flipping him over,
Yep.
um, not really caring. And then another thing you touched on at the start, which I want to talk about, is hand checking and
Yep.
just the way defense was played back then, where you weren't allowed to play a zone,
Yep.
but you could hand check,
Yep.
and I mean hand checking it kind of gets a little overrated, but at the same time, it's like it's definitely something you don't want to have as an
Yep.
offensive player, um,
Yeah.
where a guy's literally holding you at the hip.
Yep.
Um, like one, it makes defense way easier
Yep.
when a guy's holding you at the hip.
Yeah. I think that's a big part of the reason why guys like Hardaway and Kevin Johnson, they really kind of had to become these traditional point guards because of hand checking, because they had limited abilities with the hand on the hip kind of thing to score a lot.
Yeah, and also one thing that Chris Paul always says when he's defending is he always looks at the hips
Yep.
because the hips determine what direction you're going.
Yep.
When you have a guy with a hand on your hip, it's kind of hard because you already know where he's going. So
Yep.
the defender could lock you down a lot easier, and that's why I think there was no need for a zone because a guy's already in front of you um, to begin with.
Yeah. It makes it easier, especially for perimeter defenders, I find.
hmm The one thing that a zone would benefit, like teams would benefit from a zone when it comes to like, especially during that era where 3-point shooting wasn't necessarily the most used skill.
Yep.
Obviously, you have teams now like the Raptors that use zone defense all the time, right? But
Yep.
even when it kind of became legal, it wasn't really it was a wasn't really used too much
Yeah.
at the professional level.
Yeah. A lot of people think that zones would be able to stop a lot of the talented big men of the era. But at the same time, when zones were implemented against Shaq, they didn't really do too much. So I think got like talented players like Hakeem and Ewing and David Robinson, they would have been able to find their way around zone defenses.
Yeah, and I mean when you talk about players like Jordan, I mean the Pistons were basically running a modified zone to begin with.
Yep.
So it's um it would have made a big difference maybe the first couple of years, which it did, but
Yep.
like in the long term, if it was legal all along, I don't think it would have made too much of a difference.
Yep.
Especially for players like Jordan, who had a great post game. Obviously, when you're playing elementary school basketball, your little elementary school coach always tells you to this is how you beat a zone. You just put him in the you put the other team in the post.
Yep.